semi to informal discussion of some topic concerning international adaptation. I'm going to let Andre introduce Ed. We're going to do it like, the Wilson Center, where you have 6 introductions. We're just going to have 2. But I did want to say that we do this every month on the 3rd Thursday of the month, unless it's a holiday. And next month, the 3rd Thursday is not Thanksgiving. So we'll be meeting, I believe it's the 20th. And next month, we have a program called IRAP, which is the International Research and Applications Program. It's a jointly implemented climate information, climate service program led by Columbia University's IRI and the University of Arizona, and funded by NOAA and sort of managed with input mostly from NOAA and from my team. So that'll be in November. I believe it's November 20th. In December, Frank Cesno, who used to be with CNN, he now is the director of the media program at GW, at George Washington University, and he is, I think he and some of his students are going to come in and talk about the programs that they do. They, among other things, they make videos and other multimedia documentations of development projects in different parts of the world. And Frank is particularly interested in development and climate issues, and so it should be fun. I watched a video that some of his students made about a woman in, I think she was in Kenya, and she was, I think she was promoting composting. I watched it quickly before meeting with Frank, so I would know what his movie was about, and clearly I need to watch it again. That's Frank calling to say, pay attention. And then in January, we had thought we were going to have John Matthews from AGWA, the Global Water and Adaptation Alliance, or something like that. The name doesn't line up with the letters, but AGWA sounds better. And now John's going to call and tell me what it really is. John, we are hoping, John can't come in January, he may come in February. Did he respond? Okay. And we're going to line up somebody for January. If anybody has ideas or suggestions, let Lily or me know. I have one person in mind, but I haven't asked him, so I won't announce him now, although I guess I could lock him in by committing him. Anyway, so today we have Ed. Andre's going to introduce him. Next month, we have the IRAP Climate Service Program that's going to be able to give a readout of some of the very interesting work they've done in the Caribbean, building on some of the work that we did in Jamaica, and then working with a number of the other countries in the region. And the work that they've been doing has, among other things, changed the way that this past summer, the Caribbean region prepared for hurricane season. They anticipated the El Nino. They anticipated a very low activity year, and they anticipated the drought, and so we're able to get messages out to a variety of stakeholders so they could begin planning for dry conditions rather than rain and wind. So, over to Andre.
Thanks, John. Good afternoon, everybody. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Andre Mershon, and I work with John in the Global Climate Change Office at USAID. I'm one of the adaptation specialists there. I want to talk a little bit about the work and where the genesis of this work, and then introduce Dr. Carr, who's going to give the presentation today. So part of the reason that this work is here and why we're interested in this questions around gender and adaptation is, as many of you are aware of and many of you have assisted over the last couple of years, USAID is very interested in kind of looking at vulnerability assessment, understanding vulnerability, both from kind of a technical and from a social point of view, and many of you in this room have been a huge part of that specific effort. One of the things that we want to look at in terms of vulnerability is social issues and how gender fits into vulnerability. And this research is partially a product of collaboration between myself and Natalie Elwell, who's here representing the Gender and Development Office at USAID, because really these issues kind of cut across our offices and our practices. And one of the challenges that Natalie and I have found fairly consistently is you have gender specialists and you have climate specialists, or you have gender specialists and you have red specialists, or you have gender specialists and you have energy specialists, and they don't talk to each other. They talk past each other, and they don't think practically about, or there's not enough discussion about practically about what we can do to address some of these issues. And so part of the reason that we engaged Ed was to get a handle on, practically speaking, how can we engage some of these issues? And also, practically speaking, how can we make the case and make it more strongly that we need to address these gender issues in the work that we do, but also how do we do it? What do we need to be looking at? What are the techniques we need to use? What kind of analysis is useful for us? And so where we are today is we have a nice piece of research. There's a whole paper that was released on this, and I'll see if I have a copy I can wave around. I do. So what Ed is presenting on today is basically a summary of what's in this 100-plus page paper. There's also a 2-page summary which is in the back, which you can take with you, and that has a link to the website where the PDF is for the full paper. But I think really what you probably want, as most people, is you want the executive summary, you want to know the bottom line, and that's what Ed's here to talk about today. And so with that, let me also introduce Ed and give a little bit on his background. Ed brings a very unique and useful background to this work. Ed is a professor at the University of South Carolina. There's a little logo down there. I think we're in the South Carolina room today. Is that right, John? I believe we are. Okay, so it's totally intentional. And Ed wears a number of hats at the University of South Carolina. He's a professor of geography there. But one of the distinctions is that Ed used to work for USAID. Ed came to USAID from 2010 to 2012. He was a AAAS fellow, and he worked for the DACHA Bureau, which is the Democracy, Conflict, and Humanitarian Affairs Bureau. And then he also worked on his affairs or assistance. Assistance, thank you, Ed. And Ed also spent a year in our office, among other things, working on the climate change and development strategy. And so one of the things that's been very useful in our collaboration with Ed, when Ed went back to academia, is we said, well, here's an academic who has the experience in the academic realm, who understands published literature, who understands survey methodologies, but also someone who is grounded in what we do, what our constraints are, and what our opportunities are. And so that's really what the collaboration with Ed has been extremely useful for. So with that, I will turn it over to Ed, and then we'll have some good time at the end for discussion, because really we do want kind of your thoughts on this. We've presented this twice internally at USAID and USDA this morning. This is the first time that we've presented it for an external audience, and especially for the implementers in the room. We're very curious to know what you think of this and feasibility, things of that nature. So,
thank you. I never use a microphone, so this will be amusing. Thank you, John and Andre. Thank you, everybody, for coming out this afternoon, especially on 4 o'clock, on a Thursday. I appreciate everyone coming out. That was pretty well set up, so let's just jump to why we're here in the first place, what I'm going to accomplish over the next, say, 25 minutes or so. First thing I'm going to do at a sort of very high level is I'm going to review the state of knowledge on gender and adaptation. That is to say, I'm going to tell you what the literature says, and I'm going to tell you about what's going on in terms of practice that we see out in the world. The second thing that I'm going to do after that is very briefly review the implications of that state of knowledge for development and adaptation programs. And the third thing I'm going to do is then talk about how, or at least consider a little bit, how we might use all this information to then build more effective programs. So we're going to go along all those lines today. First of all, what have we done? Well, Andre already talked about the report that we did for USAID. When I say we, by the way, I keep having to remind everyone, I don't speak in the royal we. I'm not that guy. It's me. I have a lab at the University of South Carolina, which has a research associate and several PhD students. I have PhD students who've left after finishing their degrees. Most of the stuff that I do is in some way collaborative with them, so there's rarely a me, it's usually a we kind of thing. So when I say we, that's who I'm referring to. So one of the things that we've done up to this point, we produced the report that Andre described to you that really had two parts. It was a literature review that sort of assessed the current state of knowledge, and then through 3 case studies, looked at the implications of that state of knowledge empirically, thinking about how different views on gender allow us to see different kinds of things. We also then took the state of knowledge component, the lit review, academiced it up, if that's what you want to say, but really beefed it up a lot, published it in the journal Geography Compass, which is a very highly cited journal for large review articles in our discipline, that basically captures, again, the state of knowledge part of this. And we did this for 2 reasons. One is it's important to disseminate these findings out to the academic community that works on these issues. But the second part really is to establish a level of intellectual legitimacy for thought leadership coming out of some USAID programs. That's something that USAID is trying to emphasize now, and I think it makes a lot of sense to do this because it does build a lot more legitimacy for the agency and its work in a wider community. So, that's what we've done. What's the state of knowledge? 3 major points sort of capture the state of knowledge on gender and adaptation right now. The first of these is almost all current work on gender and adaptation makes one fundamental assumption that gender is in fact a critical determinant of people's vulnerability to climate variability and change. The second one is that if you look at these studies, if you look at the research, if you look at the stuff that's been implemented, which isn't that much, all these things tend to treat men and women as homogeneous groups. In other words, they tend to take the approach, there are men, there are women, they are different, they are somehow differently vulnerable in a very sort of fundamental way. They don't tend to look inside those categories much. And the third thing is that almost all of these approaches assume that women are somehow subservient or less powerful than men, and therefore that contributes to their vulnerability to climate variability and change. These are all assumptions that you can find, usually all 3 of these, but several of them at least at any given time in the literature. So to summarize this, let me give you an example of what this would mean in practice. I'll do this through a hypothetical example. Let's pretend that we're in some hypothetical community somewhere in sub-Saharan Africa. Since we're talking about agrarian settings, the principal livelihoods we're dealing with here are agricultural. And one of the things, if you've done any work on agriculture or agricultural livelihoods in sub-Saharan Africa, you know, is that different crops are differently vulnerable, or they're differently sensitive, really, to fluctuations in precipitation. So tree crops, for example, are pretty handy because they're not really that sensitive to fluctuations, seasonal fluctuations in precipitation, as opposed to, say, vegetable crops, which are extremely sensitive to this. And so you can get really wide swings in yield. So if you have a lot of tree crop, you're not going to be as worried about these kinds of fluctuations. So you can go into a community and you can say, all right, who's got the tree crops, who does not? And doing a quick survey, if you went with sort of this binary thing, men and women, you might find that, I don't know, 75, 80% of men are raising tree crops. But you go over on this side and you realize, oh, only about 15% of women seem to be raising tree crops. Now, a lot of analyses of this kind of work would say, okay, tree crops are gendered. They're gendered male. Therefore, men are far more likely to have access to these things. Therefore, men are less vulnerable to fluctuations in precipitation, at least in terms of that aspect of their livelihoods. And women, therefore, are much more vulnerable. The problem is, of course, that assumes that all men are the same and all women are the same. And that never holds. For any of you who spent any time on the ground anywhere, you know that that's not a reasonable assumption. If you really get into this community, for example, you might find that one important way in which people are different is that you have older and younger men, older and younger women. That may have a lot to do with social rank and therefore the roles and responsibilities that people have, therefore the ways in which they might be impacted by climate variability and change. And when you break people out that way, and then look at what they're growing, you might find a really different picture. You might find that old men pretty much have all got tree crops, whereas young men, only a few actually have them. And you might note that all of the women, that 15% I was talking about, all of those women are actually old women, and young women have absolutely none. So in fact, what you've got are old men with almost no real concerns for variability in precipitation. You've got actually old women and young men with very similar concerns because their farms actually look quite similar, and young women who have an entirely different set of problems to deal with. If you don't disaggregate your population by these different kinds of social categories that would say shape access to tree crops, then you don't actually know what's going on with folks. You don't actually identify what their particular vulnerabilities are. So what does this mean then for us in terms of, again, this is in Broadway. This is what we took away, again, from a broad literature review, looking at a lot of different work on the ground too. First of all, you cannot assume that gender is an isolated or even primary cause of people's vulnerability to climate variability and change. Often it is, but if you assume that going in, you're going to run into situations where it's not that important, and you're going to start programming against things that don't exist. That obviously won't succeed on the ground. The second thing, you cannot assume that men and women are homogeneous categories, nor can you assume that one or the other is inherently the most vulnerable in any community. There are plenty of situations where, in fact, women are more vulnerable than men. But there are other situations where you have particular kinds of women who in fact are not more vulnerable and in fact maybe less vulnerable than men to different kinds of climate impacts. So you have to actually go in and establish this empirically. You can't start from that assumption. And the third big takeaway point is that really when you look at vulnerability to climate variability and change, it's not shaped by a single identity and the roles and responsibilities that are attached to that identity. It tends to be attached to the intersection of several different identities and their roles and responsibilities. So it could be gender plus income plus age, and how all those things fit together. They shape your particular roles and responsibilities that then shape how the ways in which you are exposed to or sensitive to or have to adapt to climate variability and change. So if those are the big takeaways on sort of the state of knowledge, in the report we then pivoted a little bit to talk empirically about what any of this meant on the ground. And what we were really trying to do is illustrate how different lenses on gender, say this binary view, men versus women, versus a more complex view, allows us to see different kinds of things and perhaps act in different sorts of ways. And we put together 3 case studies. They all come from sub-Saharan Africa, but from some pretty diverse settings, Mali, Ghana, and Malawi. I'm not going to go through all of these because there's a lot going on. As Andre mentioned, it's a fairly long report. The cases themselves are all pretty long. What I am going to do is talk in a broad way about some of the things we know about vulnerability from this, and I'll illustrate through one example in one part of the cases some of the stuff that you'll see if you look into this report. First of all, the report for us demonstrates that there's really and these case studies demonstrate that there are 2 kinds of vulnerability. And we see this, by the way, as a contribution to the literature on vulnerability, not merely just parroting back what's going on. First of all, we would argue that there are distinct vulnerabilities. When we talk about distinct vulnerabilities, we're talking about exposure, people who are experiencing different exposures to a particular stressor. A way to illustrate this is you're thinking about a community where part of the community lives in a floodplain and part of the community lives upland. Only part of that community is exposed to flooding. Therefore, within that community, you have distinct exposures going on. Differentiated exposures are where people have the same, differentiated vulnerabilities are where people have the same exposure. So let's say we're now all looking at people only in that floodplain. So they're all dealing with the exposure to that flood, but they have different sensitivities and adaptive capacities. So if we're talking about only the people living in the floodplain, maybe men principally work on pastoral livelihoods, owning cattle, and women are conducting all the agriculture. Well, when a flood comes, men can move their cattle upland, but agriculture doesn't move. Therefore, you have a differentiated vulnerability to the same stressor. There's a different sensitivity and adaptive capacity there. And so we need to actually identify both kinds of vulnerability if we're going to program against them. I'll give you an example of some of what I'm talking about here and how this actually complicates how we understand gender and therefore how we understand some of these vulnerabilities to climate variability and change. I'll talk about the Ghana case study. I'm a laser pointer not working. I'm a geographer, and I teach geography of sub-Saharan Africa. It's always amusing where people think Ghana is located, or for that matter, where they think Africa is located. But in any case, don't get me going. In any case, well, I'm going to trust you guys know where Africa is. And we're going to go, the Ghana, if we're talking about here, the study area I'm talking about is right on the coast there, and we're looking at sort of these 2 communities in here as the principal empirical examples I'm going through. And the stuff I'm going to talk about, we gathered this through ethnographic methods. I'm going to talk a little bit more about methods later. But a lot of work living in these communities, interviewing people. We actually trained sort of local graduate students and faculty on a lot of these methods, and villagers even, to help us do this. So we spent quite a bit of time in these communities talking to people to come to understand their vulnerabilities, what they perceived as their vulnerabilities, their livelihoods, all of this sort of work that came into this study. So let's talk a little bit about distinct and differentiated vulnerabilities in the context of these 2 communities, Domanadzi and Pongkrum. And let's just talk about women, because if I break this up by the whole community, we'll be here for quite a while. So, first level, we can talk about distinct vulnerabilities. In this particular case, remember, vulnerability doesn't have to be to a climate stressor to have relevance to sort of your vulnerability to climate variability and change. In this particular case, the distinct vulnerability has everything to do with land tenure. Here, women gain access to land through the male head of household. And since they're all pretty much monogamous households, it's through their husband. So female-headed households have a really unique problem. They have no access to land directly. They do get land, it's through their fathers or through their mother's uncles, because this is a matrilineal society, but they get tiny, tiny slivers of land. Land tenure is incredibly precarious. They do not have it year to year, so it really constrains, for example, what they can plant. You're not going to put tree crops on a plot that you may not own 6 months from then. And it's really, really tiny plots that actually aren't even large enough to produce enough food or income for those households. So they have run into a unique problem. They are actually distinctly exposed to the challenge of accessing land compared to all the married women. So we have a distinct exposure there, and you can see where that creates a challenge. These women are not going to plant tree crops. They're not going to be able to extensify their farms. Right away, they have a unique kind of set of challenges when it comes to dealing with climate variability and change. So there's one group, and that's fine. But married women, while they may not be separable in terms of their access to land, therefore don't have a distinct vulnerability there, do have differentiated vulnerabilities. Because there's two big livelihood strategies that operate in this village in married households. One, which I've been calling a diversified strategy, where men farm for market sale, women farm for subsistence production, something that's a very common model you see in sub-Saharan Africa. And a market household strategy where everyone farms for market sale, but women use the proceeds of that to then meet the subsistence needs of the household. So women are playing the same role, but through different means in these households, and therefore, as a result, even though in both households everyone's exposed to, say, market fluctuations, because in both households, someone in that household is engaged with the market for the purposes of meeting household needs, women in market households are much more directly exposed to that because, of course, they're selling into that market all the time. They're not merely waiting for their husbands to bring stuff back. And as a result, they have a differentiated exposure to markets. Also, because these women are selling out at market, they tend to have more tree crops, which tend to be cash crops. As a result, they are usually, in terms of their farms, somewhat less sensitive to fluctuations in precipitation than women who are farming in diversified households. Again, that's a differentiated vulnerability because they're dealing with the same variability in precipitation, they just have a different sensitivity to it. So you end up with three groupings of women here, if you break them out by these different kinds of vulnerabilities. Female-headed households, women operating under the market household strategy, women operating under a diversified household strategy. If you lumped all women together in these communities, and treat this just as a binary analysis, and you looked at their agricultural strategy, which we can represent here by the crops they grow, sort of rank ordered from most to least popular, and by what they're going to do with those crops, whereas it gets darker here, they're more for market sale. And if you quickly look at this, you can quickly see the problem I'm going to point out. The aggregated sort of strategy for women looks an awful lot like the women in market households and not so much like the women in diversified households or female-headed households. If we aggregate everything together, what you're looking at is really the strategy of one group of women. You can't see 60% of the women in this community. And by the way, that's the poorest 60% of the women in this community. So if you're programming against what's going on in this community, if you're trying to deal with things like poverty, if you're trying to deal with things like vulnerability, you've got a major problem here. You can't see the very people you're supposed to be aimed at. This is the kind of thing, by the way, we did throughout this report. We basically said, here's what binary analysis looks like. Here's what, when we break things down and start going into particular categories and more complex understandings, here's what you can see. We did this over and over and over to illustrate what we were talking about. We did this in southern Mali, overarching finding there. Binary analysis misses the point that the intersection of gender and age, really gender and seniority, greatly shapes the roles and responsibilities that lead to who gets to make decisions about agricultural practice, and therefore greatly shapes people's vulnerability to climate variability and change. If you miss that, you're missing a lot of what's going on. And in southern Malawi, I always refer to this as the finding people either really like or really hate. Binary gender analysis, but also, to be honest, even the more complex gender analysis couldn't show us any gendered vulnerability to climate variability and change, which people find a little bit surprising, but if you understand agricultural practice around Mount Mulanje, the Chewa there, pretty much husbands and wives farm exactly the same plot of land. And while they perform different activities on that land, it's one plot of land for the whole household. So whatever impact climate has impacts everybody living off that farm. So as a result, there isn't actually a difference in terms of people's vulnerability by gender. So some of the takeaways that come out of all of this. First of all, if we want to think about productive gender analysis, and I know we have people in the room who work with implementers, that kind of thing. Productive gender analysis does not stop with men and women, and they are different, and therefore there are different vulnerabilities. That is not a productive route. Productive gender analysis, in the end, is almost always going to reveal how gender intersects with one or more other sets of social roles and responsibilities, be that age, be that income, be that something else. Rarely, I mean, every once in a while, just the simple categories, man and woman, shape a lot of vulnerability, but you really have to empirically demonstrate that. You cannot assume that. More often than not, way more often than not, binary gender analysis, which is about men and women, is going to obscure more than it reveals. It's going to obscure an awful lot of variability and vulnerability among men and among women, which means you're going to miss a lot of the stuff you need to see if you're going to be dealing with people's adaptation needs, both in the short and long term. And the last point that I like to point out to folks all the time is we also then have to accept that sometimes climate variability and change are not going to produce gendered impacts, which sometimes is problematic if, say, you're working on this with gender money. Negative findings are okay, right, Natalie? It's academia, that's my first thought. Negative findings are publishable. But no, in this case, that might be a problem. It's something to think about in any case. But it is true that sometimes you're not going to get a gendered impact. In terms of the different kinds of vulnerability I was just talking about, distinct and differentiated, both distinct and differentiated vulnerabilities are possible outcomes of any impact of climate variability and change. You can see these things between groups. You're going to see these things among groups. So you're going to have to unpack to find out what kinds of vulnerabilities are there. I will tell you this, from what we see, again, looking at the literature, looking at what people have done, looking at our own case studies, binary gender analysis usually brings forth distinct vulnerabilities pretty clearly. You can get at that exposure-led stuff. But getting at differentiated vulnerabilities, which usually require unpacking all those social categories, it's very hard to do that if you're doing binary analysis. You're usually going to miss those, and very often those are more important in terms of determining who's vulnerable to what than issues of distinct vulnerability. So, what do we do if this is all the case? I think the first thing we're going to have to do is think about how we might modify our expectations for gender analysis. We can do all the stuff I just described. When I think about talking to people at USAID and everything else, one of the things that's been pointed out, one of the things that we say is, you can do the kind of analysis I'm talking about or a binary analysis. Both of them fall under the ADS. Both of them are legitimate, at least institutionally. So it's not enough to suggest somehow that we don't necessarily have to do a big change to agency policy or anything else. What really just has to happen is we have to think differently about what a useful gender analysis is that helps us achieve the goals that we might have with programs and projects and all that kind of thing. How do we modify those expectations? Well, for example, if you're looking at a binary gender analysis that's come back to you, or if someone's going to go out and implement something in the field and their methodology is kind of set up for some sort of binary analysis, one of the first things you need to do is justify that particular approach. Why is that the right way to be looking at the situation here? Don't assume it is, because you're likely going to get walked back at some point because you'll have missed something. You have to also, along with that, accept that sometimes when you come back with your findings, you're not going to find gender as a determinant of vulnerability, and that could be okay. One of the ways to, again, deal with addressing whether or not binary gender analysis makes any sense is to review the proposed methods that are coming back in. You have to ensure that they're going to capture both distinct and differentiated vulnerabilities. Really key point here, surveys aren't a very good tool for this. They're just not. They're really not useful for getting at differentiated vulnerabilities. And the reason for this is very simple. Almost all surveys, you have to design them, including thinking about who you're targeting in your sample before you show up in the particular place, which means you don't actually know who your categories are before you get there. That's your problem. You don't actually know who's distinctly vulnerable, who's differentially vulnerable. So as a result, you show up, you drop a survey into this place, you're likely to start missing things. Surveys are okay at getting distinct vulnerabilities, but then again, so is walking through a village very often. So I would suggest strongly that you're going to have to think carefully methodologically about what's going on here. And one of the ways that you can modify some of these expectations is to think about the tools that you use. I believe strongly in the right tool for the job. Sometimes surveys are actually very useful tools, but other times they're not. And you know the old line, when all you got's a hammer, everything looks like a nail. You don't want to turn gender analysis into the nail, okay? There's a lot of different things that you can do here. There are ways to bring all kinds of qualitative tools into assessment without blowing up projects, especially if you build them in upfront as you're setting up things like baselines, as you're designing things like M&E. If you do this upfront, if you do this intelligently, you can do all this kind of stuff. My lab there, we use an approach that I've developed. It's a livelihoods approach that I've developed over about the last 15 or so years. I managed to get it into a couple of peer-reviewed journals, which at least in academia legitimates me. It works on the ground, which seems to legitimate with these guys, so that's also been helpful. And in that approach, we use all kinds of tools, but we are using a lot of qualitative stuff, semi-structured interviewing. We live in the communities where we do the work, so we're talking about, participant observation over at least several weeks. When I say several, like 7 weeks minimum kind of thing, and sometimes longer. And we deal in focus groups a lot if we can find that as a way of triangulating different forms of information. One of the things that we've talked about both within sort of USAID and other places, but also thinking about my colleagues who work at different implementers, is how this work might be enabled, how this could be set up so that people can do this. Because I think there's a lot of people who are interested in doing this kind of work and designing projects with this resolution of information where it's appropriate. And so one of the things that's going to have to be done is thinking about how this work can be responded to through either PADs or really RFPs and RFAs, and how those things then get built into PADs and things like that down the line. For example, this is the kind of thing that can be proposed under baseline setting, which is supposed to be done under a lot of projects. You can think about how these methods fit into this kind of thing. And do not fear qualitative methods, okay? There's a lot of people who are terrified of these things for various reasons. They do not necessarily take too long. It does depend on the context. It does depend on the situation. But I would argue that the kinds of information, the kind of resolution of information we're getting out of our methods allow for such a greater return on that investment later in terms of how you design things and how well projects work, that it's worth the investment of a little bit of time, if it even runs long, and a little bit more money if it's actually slightly more than your normal budget. So for example, we did a full-on livelihood study looking at some climate services stuff in Mali and Senegal, and some work looking at disaster risk reduction in Zambia with the Red Cross. So we've done this 3 different times. We've done it with different sized teams and different sized areas. But generally speaking, here's what you get. It takes us about 7 weeks to run the entire fieldwork component. And then it takes us about 3 to 4 months to do the analysis. It depends on how large an area you're talking about, depends on how fast you want to go. We can employ more people. It's an issue there. In any case, that's to do the entire livelihoods analysis. The part we're talking about here, the gender analysis, the understanding who's vulnerable to what bit, is really only the first part of that. We can do that in about 60% of the time, maybe 70%. That includes the field work and doing the analysis. So we're not talking about huge amounts of time here to do this. It's comparable to a lot of survey timelines. It's also important to note that this doesn't have to be too expensive. There are many ways to do this. Cost for us depends on scale and time frame, as I'm sure you guys all understand, everyone who's had to write a budget for this kind of stuff. Give you a range of what we've been dealing with. Again, we put 4 teams in 4 villages. We had to deliver after doing the field work. We had about 6 months to get our analysis done. It's going to cost around $100,000 to do that, but it is covering all of southern Mali in terms of what we're doing there. In terms of the stuff we did in Kafrine and the stuff we did in Zambia, that was much smaller scale, much smaller project scale. So single community, single person. We set about the same timeline for delivery. That's going to run around $40,000. And I would point out, as I put those numbers out there for you, that is for the whole analysis, doing the whole livelihoods thing. Were we, again, only tasked with, say, doing the gender analysis component the way I'm talking about, you're, again, talking about 60 to 70% of that budget, because it just won't take us that much time to do that kind of work. And again, this makes these things comparable to the cost of comprehensive surveys and comparable to their timelines. But the resolution of information you get is much, much higher. By the way, last bit, I know this has been a long-standing knock on people who look at qualitative methods. The results can be generalizable. They aren't just about the community in which you gathered them. You have to think very carefully about how you set up your methods. You have to think carefully about the claims you make. But for example, our approach really is aimed at understanding how people make decisions. We don't say, okay, because these outcomes happen in this community, they happen everywhere in southern Mali. We talk about how Malian farmers make decisions in these different areas, and therefore we can translate that kind of decision-making broadly within a cultural context. We're also working on validating that later this spring by linking our results to large-scale panel data sets to see if we can get some quantitative validation to the work that we've been doing. There we go. What are we doing next here? We're going to be doing some training modules. We're going to be building some training modules. We'll work with Andre and Natalie to do that kind of stuff. We're going to be doing stuff internally, hopefully so that USAID staff can get a better understanding of this current state of knowledge that we're talking about here. So that when staff start thinking about the stuff that they're programming, the things that they're managing, they're more up to date on what we know is going on in the world, what we know is going on in the literature. We're going to also be thinking about, I'm going to skip down here, I'm running out of time. We're going to be doing some supporting materials. Some of the work that we're doing under CCRD, which includes some of the case studies you see there. We're going to be building this stuff into the Marginal Populations Annex of the Climate Resilient Development Framework. So this is, all this stuff is CCRD products. This stuff actually feeds back into itself. That CCRD is a coherent whole, folks. It really is. It may not look like it sometimes, but I swear, it really is. At least it feels like it to me inside there. And we're working with these guys on other forms of agency guidance. So with that, that's kind of everything that we've been doing up to this point. That's where we see the state of knowledge. That's where we see some opportunities. Again, that's me, my lab, but it's also talking with Andre and Natalie about some of these things. And what I'm not doing here, let me make something really clear. What I'm not doing is telling you guys what has to happen, because that's not terribly useful. What I'm doing is pointing out what the literature says, what we see happening on the ground, what the empirical findings are, and everything I just said in terms of suggestions, thinking about changing expectations, all that. Think of those as prompts that I'm kind of lobbing out to this room to see how you guys respond to that, to see what ideas you have, to tell me I'm out of my mind, whatever it is that you guys have as a reaction, so that we can hopefully learn from you guys and move forward on a lot of these ideas. Thanks.
So thank you, Ed. We'll have questions out, and I think at the beginning I forgot to introduce myself. I'm John Furillo. I'm with USAID. I'm in the climate change office, and I work in the adaptation program. And CCRD that Ed mentioned is a contract that my team manages with IRG Agility, who hosts us here this month and next month at Carnegie. So if you have questions for Ed, do you want to just identify people?
I guess if you want to ask a question, you have to wave at Lily because she has a microphone.
Raise your hand. Lily will find it.
John?
Oh, if you would introduce yourselves so that the people online and us know who you are.
John Magisto, I'm a consultant. Throughout West Africa in various areas, caste is a very important social marker of identity. And I'd be curious to know, and particularly in Senegal and Mali, if you did pay attention to caste and what kind of findings you might have generated from that observation.
Sure. Thanks, John. So in our first, I should maybe backstory this slightly. The work we're doing in Mali and the work we're doing in Senegal, both are about climate service programs. One of them we're evaluating is too strong a word, assessing maybe, Mali's Agro-Meteorological Advisory Program. In Senegal, we're working with CG, the CG, to look at maybe standing up a program there. In Mali, the first cut where we actually have hard data that I can really talk about in detail, we were first just trying to figure out if anybody was using the information. So we did not look at caste because we were referring to the literature to do a very quick cut, an expert judgment. We have a number of people who'd worked in Mali before to basically divide up our sample by gender and age and start to look at it that way. That said, we did find some interesting patterns of use. So this past summer, and John and I saw each other in Mali briefly this summer before my teams went out, one of the things they were tasked with doing was actually figuring out what the relevant groupings are. We are in the middle, we are in the first quarter of wading through that data right now. And actually I talked with my research associate yesterday for the first time about some of the stuff. Caste has not come up yet. The age gender thing has come up. Income is now looming. Very, very large for us in this particular case. And it makes a lot of sense why income would matter heavily here, because what we're finding, one of the things we found with the climate service work is in Mali that somewhere on the order of 15 to 20% of the men in most places that have access to these advisories are actually using them. which sounds like a disturbingly low number. On the other hand, we found that 15 to 20% who were using it were religiously following the advisories, right? And farmers tend not to use worthless information, especially stuff that's been used for years. So when we got in there, one of the things, and we were unpacking, we find that actually it's access to animal traction, access to plows, which of course are the wealthier people in the community. If you have an animal and you have a plow, you can go out and respond to an advisory right away, and if you don't, you're going to wait. And if you're waiting, the advisory eventually expires. And in this part of the world, of course, it rains for like 3-4 days, and there's a 2-week pause anyway. So if you didn't plow your field and plant it at that point, you're waiting at least 2 more weeks. So it's, somewhere between 14 and 20 days. You've shifted 1 to 2 cycles of variety in terms of what you're dealing with. So that seems to be pretty important. I would not say that we've ruled it out. If it comes up in our data, we'll certainly deal with it then, but it hasn't shown up in our data yet. Sure.
I actually have a question about the process of doing these surveys. Do you feel that the gender of your team comes into play when collecting accurate survey data, and how do you see that in the field?
Surveys and then the other stuff that we do are pretty different things. I think the gender of the team doing the work does matter a lot. We tried to get a gender balanced team for the work we were doing in Mali, and we didn't quite pull it off. It's sometimes, especially if you're working with teams in sub-Saharan Africa, finding women who are educated and qualified to do the work, who people will actually identify and help you get to, that can be very challenging at times. So building up a core of people who can do the work is challenging. That said, yes, it matters enormously, because women typically will talk to women about different issues than they'll talk to men. Even if you're an outsider and you can mobilize that outsiderness, it doesn't mean they'll necessarily talk about everything. I'll give you an example of this actually from Ghana, the story I always tell people. The Ghanaian work goes all the way back to like my dissertation. So I spent about 2 years in the end of my life in these villages. I'm not suggesting, by the way, that's a methodology you should use. But 2 years, although it's fun, you're hanging out in villages. But I had spent something on the order of, I want to say about 9 or 10 months or something like that, in these villages doing a lot of work. And one of the things I was looking at, because at the time I was also doing archaeological work, I was really interested in vessels and how they're used, like cooking vessels. And I could not get women to talk to me about cooking vessels. They would tell me all about farming, they would tell me about all kinds of things, they would not talk to me about cooking, and that makes sense because men there simply do not cook. The one man who ever cooked for me gave me salmonella, so no, you do not. Chicken shouldn't be raw, should it? No, you don't. Rare is not good for chicken, it turns out. But in any case, I should have known that. But my wife shows up, my then girlfriend, now wife, shows up, like I said, 9, 10 months, whatever. She shows up and is going to spend 3 months. And she shows up, and one day I say, because I'm just frustrated, I'm like, I get my research assistant, I just say, go with my wife, go, because then the village, they refer to her as my wife. Go with my wife, see what they'll tell her. Therese goes and sits down. She comes back an hour and a half later, translated with this notebook full of stuff. And I wanted to jump out a window because, of course, she showed up and these senior women in the village said, we should educate the younger woman as to how to be a good wife. She should know how to cook. Here are all the pots. And they proceed to explain everything to her. So the gender of your team matters tremendously. So you really do have to take this stuff into account. You can't always do it, but if you can't do it, the other thing you need to do then is be extremely sensitive to what you may or may not be able to see and try to take that into account as well. Don't be overconfident in your information if you don't have that gender balance.
Hi, Patty Christensen from the International Center for Research on Agroforestry in Nairobi. Thank you, and I was really happy that you used the tree crop example, by the way. That was great. We've been struggling in the CGIAR, in the International Agricultural Research world, with shifting from purely diagnostic work to more action research, where you're empowering women while you're spending hours and hours and hours bothering them, by the way. So I was really happy how you talked about qual and quant methods together and how they're so important. But I'd love to hear about how you're thinking about the way forward in this to get past the purely diagnostic research where we say, okay, women are spending so much more time, or young women, or whatever. I think we know how to do that. How do we get to the more real action research where you're testing different kinds of interventions and really monitoring how they change people's lives over time? And could you touch upon ICTs and how we could be using cell phones and things like that in a much more imaginative way as researchers? Because I'll bet you've thought about that a bit.
A little bit, yes. Let me answer that part last, though. So this is a really good question, a very, very fair question, and one that academics are usually pretty awful at answering. Luckily, I'm only like half an academic, so it should be okay. This would be half a bad answer. So right now, I think it's a fair characterization, so diagnostic versus action. And I feel like with this work, we're still very much in sort of a diagnostic place. But the way in which we're doing the diagnostic work is very different, I think, than a lot of diagnostic work that's come before, in the sense that we're not merely identifying who does what. Okay, because when you do that, that's fine. You've mapped a landscape, but you've actually not explained anything. And if you look at a lot of the diagnostic work that's come before, right, we map who does what, and then we start making wild assumptions about why they're doing those things, which may or may not have any bearing on reality, and therefore aren't actually actionable. The work that we're doing is very much about not causal in a statistical sense, but causal or explanatory, maybe is the word I'm looking for. Who's doing what and why are they doing those things? The approach that we use is actually, I could go for a long time on the theoretical foundations of what we're doing. But basically, we're getting into why people do the things that they do in different livelihood systems. The reason I bring this up is because that, I think, will translate, and this is a plan we have going forward in various ways, that will translate into action because we know what we're trying to act on, and we know where there are opportunities to act. So let me give you an example of what I mean by all of this. If you look, we'll stick with the Ghana example. If you look at the livelihoods patterns you see among men and women in this part of Ghana, you'll notice that men have much larger fields than women. Yet women per hectare are substantially more productive. I mean 3 to 4 times per hectare more productive. That said, women are farming tiny plots. That's part of it. But you can scale their plots up, because we've seen this. We have multi-year data, so we've seen women's plots change size. They're still way more productive per hectare, even as their plots get larger. So why don't men allocate more land to their wives, because that would net generate more income, and women are always responsible for subsistence and the reproduction of the household. Wouldn't that make things better in the household? Yes, but gender roles. Gender roles here, one of the big factors in gender roles, one of the ways you define a man, there are many things that define man more broadly, but one of them is you need to earn more than your wife. You have to, and people know what you make and what your wife makes in a village. And if your wife makes more money than you, people start to call your status into question as a man. And that matters because there's a stick behind all of this. Because the man is the one who gets the land for the entire household from his clan family. And if the clan family says, we don't really respect you that much, your land holding is going to start to shrink. Your land holding starts to shrink. Not only does the man get hit, the woman gets hit. And everyone suffers. So we have year-on-year data. I mean, I actually satellite image mapped and actually walked fields of men and women over multiple years, right? You can see that men know to within 1/10 of a hectare how much land to give their wives so that they earn enough or raise enough to meet the subsistence needs of the household. And that is almost precisely what they are given each year. Because if they get any more than that, women can do whatever they want with it. And they immediately leverage it into very large increases in income because they'll go to town, sell it, go buy some stuff, come back to the village, start petty trading, and keep leveraging it up. And all of a sudden, their incomes start catching up to those of their husbands. And guess what happens in the next year? Their farms shrink. Husbands ratchet it right back down. The next time you think you're doing gender programming, you think that like peasant farming men don't understand what women can do, they know exactly what their women can do. They're making decisions that are based on more than just sort of maximization. Now, knowing that is absolutely critical for thinking about what can we do to change household incomes, to change women's status, because it's going to shape the different kinds of work we could do. One of the challenges I'm seeing there is I'm not clear on how you would raise women's incomes without raising men's incomes concurrently, which is a very different kind of program when we think about addressing women's needs than you'd normally set up, right? Normally we don't think about the men's incomes. But if you don't do that, I don't see how you have a sustainable program, because you can do it while everyone's sitting there and money's flowing in. The day you walk away is the day that ends. And also you could get really bad knock-on effects like domestic violence and other kinds of issue that can happen inside these households. So understanding that level of information, which we can get even in just 7 weeks, we can get to that resolution of information. When you have that, you are set up to actually transition into action. We need to learn how to do that, and when I say we, I do mean me and my academic colleagues. We need to spend a lot more time learning how to do that, and that means more collaboration. This is part of why I'm standing here working with people like USAID, working with folks like IRG, working with all the folks I've worked, Red Cross, because actually we need to work with folks who put things on the ground to learn how to transition this stuff over into that. So I think I'm still in a learning phase on that. I think a lot of us are still in a learning phase on that, but it's a really valid question, one that I hope I have a better answer for in a little bit of time. Sorry, question about ICTs that I need to answer first. We have looked at this. The only place that we've really thought about this in my own work is the stuff on climate services, the stuff in Mali. One of the things we've considered is the advisories are currently broadcast out by radio, and they're grounded with local, with village level sort of rain gauges, is whether or not advisories could be delivered by cell phone, whether or not local rainfall tallies could be delivered back to the Met Service, whether or not there's different kinds of, whether or not that would enable different kinds of back and forth with the Met Service, because right now it's all kind of outward, right, to the farmer, with almost no, the feedback loop is supposed to be the data, and the feedback does go back to Mali where it sits in a box somewhere. But if the feedback loop was really going in, and people could send more in than merely the rainfall total. They could also say, yeah, rainfall total plus this, this, and this are happening. We're wondering what kinds of conversations we could get out of that. John and I, about 2-3 years ago, started to talk to Frontlines, SMS, a little bit about some of these kinds of things. Started a preliminary conversation on this, but it hasn't gone very far. There's tremendous potential there for that, but again, how that fits in requires knowing some of the things I'm talking about, right? Who can we empower with these things? Handing them out to women, will that help women, or will that cause more problems than it solves? So it was waving in the...
Ed, we've got a question from the online audience. This is from Jamie Montgomery, who's the USAID Dacha Climate Change Coordinator. So Jamie says, I've seen USAID projects that may be working in hundreds of villages. You mentioned that your methods could result in generalizable results. Can you talk more about this and some of the considerations that you would need to take into account in setting up this kind of assessment?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So the thing about qualitative methods is that they're extremely context specific when you think about generalization. In a place like southern Mali, which is dominated by people, Bambara-speaking peoples, but not completely homogenous, but definitely dominated by Bambara-speaking peoples. You have folks who are dealing with the same land tenure rules, the same social rules, all that kind of stuff. When you get into decision making, you can actually make generalizable statements about a wide range of people because they're very, very similar in terms of their cultural background. If we were to transition to, say, a place like northern Ghana, that becomes a problem. Because in northern Ghana, for those of you familiar with it, you know that of Ghana's 48 mutually unintelligible languages, something like 36 of them exist above Brong-Afo, right? And if you follow the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis in anthropology, that would suggest we have 36, at least, different cultural groups up there. And while that's not completely true, the fact is they are all kind of different. They do have different kinds of rules. So how scalable some of this information actually is in other contexts is an open question. So if you asked me to do something that, say, surveyed all of northern Ghana, I'd need a lot more people and a lot more data points to feel reasonably confident. I don't feel as worried about that in a place like southern Mali where we have greater homogeneity. That said, the work we're doing in southern Mali isn't necessarily perfect. We're going to miss some of the groups that are there. We can't talk about absolutely everybody perfectly this way. So we can take it to scale depending on where we are, but this is what I meant when I said you have to think very carefully about what qualitative methods can and cannot do, and think very carefully about what it is you're answering and where you're putting them in place. So it's very context specific, and that would be something we'd have to talk about in the context of a specific place. Hopefully that answers your question, Jamie.
Hi, I'm Michael Brown from Chemonics. Sorry. So I was going to raise the point about ethnicity, and then I was thinking as you were doing your presentation about agropastoralism and sort of the complexity in terms of distinctiveness or distinctions and differentiation within that, that large segment of populations across the Sahel that are agropastoralists of, various kinds. But I was just wondering, in terms of thinking of those issues, whether, economic anthropology and, sort of the old debates about formalist and substantivist and Marxist approaches to thinking about things is not of some relevance here, because in Jamie's last question, the point being about, okay, how generalizable is all this? In fact, it's only as generalizable as the ethnic context, in my opinion, allows it to be. But the ethnic contexts stretch, are really pretty malleable across, much of the Sahelian region where you're dealing. So, it would seem, to me, is what you're saying, and we've talked about a little bit before, totally obvious, couldn't agree more, and qualitative methods are so important, and why the world doesn't understand that, good question. But it seems like if sort of this, take the Sahel or whatever region in Africa or wherever, we're approached as one where there are these ethnic distinctions, and that it's necessary to understand the qualitative basis in the social structure within which individuals make decisions at household levels. That would really help a lot, because just by going in and doing survey work, quantitative-based survey work, and not being able to, make the distinctions that really need to be made, it's really difficult to come up with appropriate, well-targeted strategies, in terms of poverty alleviation and addressing the different needs of different segments of the population and so forth. So anyway.
No, I agree with you completely. I think, one of the things we're circling here a little bit is it's that classic problem of, you can apply this to vulnerability, or you can apply this to the word resilience, right? So it's vulnerability of what to what? Resilience of what in the face of what, right? Because otherwise we're not talking about anything. We're just using a word. So in this case, we think this gets to your point, I think, because the question is of what to what actually speaks to how narrow a cultural or ethnic context we need to get into to answer some of this. Some of the things, obviously, we're way down micro, sub-household, that kind of stuff. We got a question on this earlier today from some other folks. Do we always have to go to this level? Is this always the right scale of analysis? In the end, the answer to that is no, probably not. There are times where the household, like I mentioned in the Malawi case, is probably the appropriate scale to think about vulnerability. That's where it pools. There may well be, depending on a particular kind of vulnerability, moments where even like a community level thing makes sense. It depends on what it is you're targeting there. So I think that's kind of my main thought. I would say, though, to get to those things, you have to be really careful. You still need to be sure that that's where that particular vulnerability to that particular thing, that it does pool at an individual or a household or community level. So very often I find that we still have to use, at least preliminarily, some of the approaches that my team and I have been using, at least to get in initially, establish what's going on, figure out the appropriate scale, and then we can modify as we go. We can change things. If we realize it's all about the household, we're not going to sit there and interview every single person in a household necessarily. If we realize it's about a community, we start picking out key informants inside communities, and we can start looking at a lot of communities. But you have to empirically establish that, I think. This speaks to a larger problem I think we have in development generally, and by the way, this is true of academia as well. Our existing knowledge base for a lot of the places we want to work, when we think about culturally, ethnographically, et cetera, it's really thin. Really, really thin. There are a couple of places where we have unbelievable ethnographic database that go back years and years, and like southern Ghana, for example, has just been flogged mercilessly, it seems to me, and various parts of South Africa as well, because that's when I find that an awful lot of researchers want to say they worked in Africa, they go to South Africa, which I find a little iffy. No one ever seems to want to go to the Sahel or any of these other places because it might be actually hard. I'm sorry. Put on your big boy boots and go somewhere. I can't do. Every year they send out a list, and it's like 300 people are going to South Africa, and like 2 people are going to Benin. I'm like, oh, come on. But this is a really major problem for us because that means there isn't a ton of literature for us to draw on, or my colleagues at USAID to draw on or anything like that if they want to design stuff at a program or project level. And the other problem is that the world changes, right? So even if there is existing literature, what if it's 30 or 40 years old? I mean, I've written on I once wrote a blog that got a lot of anthropologists ticked at me, where I kind of said, do ethnographies need an expiration date? Because I don't know if, I mean, Rattray was writing stuff about the Ashanti and the Fanti in the 30s. And you know, we're still referencing back to that, and I'm not sure that's a good idea. But people are doing it. So we have a major problem there, I think, that speaks again to this larger issue. We need more information on this in general. And hopefully at some point we'll actually have enough of that information that we won't have to keep having these conversations, what's the right scale of analysis, and maybe we don't always have to send someone in to establish all this empirically. We actually have a literature we could draw on to establish that before we get going.
Crispin Wilson, Rainforest Alliance. Can you speak to some of your approaches or designs with respect to getting to some of the more sensitive areas? I mean, gender is pretty sensitive, but like, for example, worst forms of child labor, the gender in the context of migrant workers.
Sure. One of the harder things, I mean, you're raising a really important issue here. One of the important things, or really hard things about doing this kind of work is to get into this level of stuff, you're going to wade into somewhat uncomfortable territory, because one of the things in my approach, one of the things that we deal in, we tend to think about people's decision making in three baskets, sort of how they think about and talk about living in particular places, the roles and identities they occupy with regard to that. But the third thing gets really tricky, what we call tools of coercion. Basically, what happens to you when you step out of line from your identity or step out of line in the things you're supposed to do. Because there are sticks in the world for people, right? Like the men who can't let their wives earn more money because then they won't get any access to land. That's a stick waiting for you. And getting at that kind of information can be extremely challenging, because sometimes the answer is domestic violence. Sometimes the answer is all kinds of other stuff that people don't want to talk about. That's why you have to go to these places, and that's why you have to be there. And 7 weeks is really short, but if you have someone who knows what they're doing, you do a lot of observation and you do a lot of listening to what isn't said. You cannot dive in on these things. It's not going to work out for you. But if you're living in these communities, if you're working with people, you establish rapport, you establish relationships with folks. Either you're going to observe things or you're going to get people to start talking about stuff. And I will say that sometimes these very sensitive issues aren't going to come out even in 7 weeks, no matter how good you are, right? One of the things I found, I'll give you another quick story to illustrate this. When looking at the situation in Ghana, again, I'd been there for a very long period of time. I built a house there, spoke the language, folks had gotten pretty used to me at this point. I was no longer interesting when I showed up. The kids ignored me, right? Other people would show up, they'd be like, that's awesome. And then I'd show up and they'd be like, whatever, just walk right past me. Sitting down with people over time, one of the things I was trying to figure out is how household economies worked, because it was clear men kept claiming they controlled all the money in the household, and women were like, no, the money from my farm is for me, and how could these two totally different things be going on? One of the things I found out is that, in fact, culturally speaking, men can withhold their income from the household for any number of reasons, which involve very small transgressions to large transgressions by their wives. Like if the wife doesn't cook a meal he likes, he can hold his money back or something like that. And that sort of started to come out in conversations. I started to hear about this. And so then I was sitting with a group of women one day, and I was talking to them about this, and I said, right, so, then he doesn't give you the money, which means now you have to pay the school fees because the children belong to your family, and that's got to tick you off. What do you do? And they're like, oh, well, we might not cook for him. Yeah, we wouldn't cook for him. Yeah. And then one of them goes, we won't sleep with him. And I'm like, because I was not prepared for that moment. And you'd establish some level of relationship there. But then, now that I had this entree, then I'd go sit with a bunch of the guys I used to go drinking with, right? And this was you've never seen a conversation like this ever. So, I was talking to some of the women. Yeah, we saw that. So, what exactly happens when you guys don't give them the money? And they were sitting there talking, oh yes, well my wife gets angry, she won't cook for me, and that's very bad, and this and this and this. And okay, so then there's this long silence. And they're all kind of sitting there, and everyone's kind of looking, and finally one guy goes, oh, my wife won't sleep with me. And you see all the other guys go, yeah, it's true, all at the same time. Then everyone like unloads all this stuff. But that was, I have to say, like 16 months in, right? And that's a lot of relationship over a lot of time. So I think that this goes back to the point I was making earlier about the gender balances on teams. You may not be able to get to that level of a relationship with people, which means you have to think about what you don't know and what you haven't seen necessarily. And really what that gets down to is not claiming too much from the analysis that you've done, not being too attached to it. One of the ways I live is basically by thinking of everything I produce as first drafts that are always going to have to be edited. And it's the same kind of thing here. We do the best we can. We try to do the most rigorous work that we can, but some of this stuff may remain hidden and pop up later. It could show up in someone else's research. It could be something that we missed. I mean, I'm currently sifting through with my team 260 interviews from this past summer, and we were coding them up for all these different kinds of ethnographic software, but there's piles of stuff in there. And by the way, there's 660 structured interviews that we have also with all these folks. We just have enormous amounts of stuff. There could be things buried in there we're not seeing, and I'm hoping, someone, the grad students, other folks will hit on that at some point. But that's a really good question.
Hi, I'm Scott Bodie. I work for ACDI Voca, also formerly USAID. The child labor issue resonates with me because I work on cocoa issues quite a bit over the last 10 years. And the industry has had to deal with the perception that child labor, the worst forms of child labor are in West Africa on cocoa farms. So then you get CNN or BBC that parachute in there seemingly on an annual basis and follow this kid around and say, look, he's on a cocoa farm. Why isn't he in school? Well, if you would just call anybody that's worked in Africa for more than, whatever, 6 months, they would say, well, if he wasn't farming cocoa, he would be farming something else because they have to pay school fees in order to go to school. It's not a matter of, but those kinds of nuances, while it's obvious to folks that have worked on the ground or anthropologists, my first degree is in anthropology, so all of this makes sense to me. The majority of the folks in the development sector maybe don't, well, I shouldn't say that, but those are the things that, we need to take into account and we need to educate folks on.
I mean, yeah, context matters immensely, right? And this goes back to what's the problem? Identifying the question, the problem that we're actually trying to address here. One of the things that lurks for me, this goes along these lines, one of the things that lurks for me here is, and we're hoping, I got to answer this question this summer. This is going to make John really anxious when I do this because he hasn't heard this yet. So real time, let's watch how John reacts. It's always fun. Now I have to compose myself. No, one of the things that came up in the initial survey when we talked to at least 660 farmers initially, right? We asked them, what are the things you're worried about? And asked them to sort of rank those things, right? Yeah, it turns out variable precipitation, not so high up the list for an awful lot of people, which could mean that we're just asking the wrong question completely here. Or, and here's the or part that makes this a little better, potentially, or variable precipitation is so ingrained into this context that people don't think about it as a vulnerability. It just is. And therefore, they don't actually talk about it as a problem because it isn't seen as soluble. Right? So, it's like talking about the air. It doesn't make any sense at all. So that may be our other thing. And the only way we're going to be able to unpack that is through going through all of these interviews that we have this summer and actually doing a lot of reading between the lines, right? Which is, how are people selecting varieties? How are people thinking about timing markets? How are they dealing with all these things? And between the lines, you can see all these efforts to actually manage variability. But they're not necessarily talking about that. So it's the same kind of thing. What is the problem that we're really trying to address here? And yeah, you can't parachute in and figure that out. And so some of what I'm thinking about, what I'm concerned with, and I know in conversation with Andre and Natalie, some of the concern here is, how do you build programs with the flexibility to do this kind of front-end work so you have a broad topic that must be addressed, but the specific work is still flexible enough to allow for this kind of stuff at the front end so that the right stuff gets targeted with the actual activities. And that's a challenge institutionally that folks have to wrestle with, and of course a challenge for the implementing community to work with that to make it all happen.
we take one more question and then wrap it up?
Michael Cody, IRG. How does your analysis process scale up? So this is very micro level. Once the economic paradigm shifts in some of these households, what does this analysis scale up to that next level of economic income for these women and men? You know, once their plots get bigger, what happens next for their analysis? Does their vulnerabilities change? Does your analysis change? Can you talk a little bit about the next level?
Sure. So one of the things, and this goes back to the question of sort of understanding, explaining why people are doing the things they do. If you understand people's decision-making frameworks, if you understand what some people would call a decision model for people, you can actually get at some of the stuff you just raised there. While I can't tell you deterministically, because we're dealing with human beings, right? Human beings are just never going to get programmed deterministically in any kind of research we do. It doesn't work out. Well, I can't tell you anything deterministically. One thing I can talk about from the work we've done, for example, in Ghana, is we can think about pathways that people are more likely and less likely to take in terms of incomes and that kind of thing. So I can tell you, if you were to give me like a concrete scenario of this kind of thing was to happen, and for the Ghana case, I feel pretty good because we have a ton of data there. If you were to tell me this kind of thing happens in this place and this is the economic impact of that for these households, I could give you a pretty reasonable set of pathways that those households are likely to be occupying in terms of activities, in terms of who's doing what, in terms of whether or not that leads to any major transformation in roles. By the way, the answer to transformation in roles is usually not, because they actually put a road right through the middle of the research area in Ghana in 2004 because it was an election year. So they didn't tell it, which led to the greatest natural experiment ever, because they didn't tell anybody they were going to do this. So all the farmers planted their fields and then the road showed up. So we had a year zero baseline of what it looks like when they plant without a road. And then we had year one and year two after they planted with the road. And it was pretty amazing. They did radically transform what they were planting and what they thought they were doing, but guess what? The underlying roles didn't change at all. Men allowed their women's farms to get bigger because men thought they were going to all go to town and get jobs, which didn't happen. So the next year, big reversion. Women's farms all start shrinking. Men all come back, start reoccupying all their farms. But even when the women's farms were allowed to get bigger, that money was still almost all going to reproduce the household. It was all still the same role. So when we're thinking about what's likely to happen under any project, unless you're thinking about some sort of really massive impact, you're looking at incremental change through pathways that we can understand. So unless it's like really discontinuous, that's kind of the stuff we can look forward a couple of years or look under, for example, we're talking about climate change, right? Under certain scenarios, and I wouldn't say like on a 20-year frame, that's really unreliable. But 5 and 10 years, if we look at sort of patterns of expected levels of variability, for example, and trends that we see, we can talk about how people are likely to deal with those and who's going to get hit by those over time. So we can think about that kind of stuff going forward. So this is a framework that does a deal with that. Sooner or later, you're going to have to go back and re-interview people. But you don't have to do that like every single year necessarily to get at this. You have to look at how much change there's been, look at the kinds of things you see going on the ground, and eventually if stuff starts looking really different, then you go back in. But that doesn't have to be every year. Thanks.
Thank you, Ed. Thanks, everybody. What are the dates for the ARC?
October 30th.
So why don't you tell everybody and then we'll send it out.
Leif Kinberg with the ARC project. We're holding the end of project event on October 30th at the Ronald Reagan building. There'll be a set of panelists with several of our assessment team leaders presenting some key findings and lessons learned from the assessments. It's a half-day event, and I think you'll enjoy it. So we'll be sending out an invitation to that, I think, to this list as well.
We'll send it out through Lily. So that again, we'll forward the announcement through the normal list for this. Next month, November 20th, is the IRAP Climate Service Program, focused currently in the Caribbean and expanding to South and or Southeast Asia and West Africa over time. And thank you for coming. Thank you, IRG, for organizing it. And we'll see you next month.